Hey, everybody. This one is a little bit personal for me. As some of you might know, I've lived in Washington, D.C. for almost a couple of years now. And D.C., of course, is not a state. We do have one congressional non voting representative. And the representative who we have is a rather magnificent woman, Eleanor Holmes Norton, but she has been there for 32 years. And if anything is obvious at this point, it's that we need new conversations in this country. We need to let new people in. We need to allow new personalities and new leadership to arise. And for that reason, I was very interested when I heard about Reverend Wendy Hamilton, who is running in this next congressional election to replace Eleanor Holmes Norton in the US Congress. Because Norton herself, Holmes Norton, is such a legendary character, I wanted to hear what is it that Wendy brings to the table. And I think she brings a lot to the table, and I support her in this candidacy. And that's why she is here today. Welcome, Reverend Hamilton. Thank you so much.
I'm so pleased to be here.
Let me give a little bit of information about you so everyone will know. Wendy Hamilton is an ordained minister, social justice advocate, and mother of one, currently residing in Washington, D.C. She has a master's in divinity from Howard University. Her professional background includes work in the areas of education, human services, nonprofit advocacy, communications, and chaplaincy. She was a part-time minister at Open Door Metropolitan Community Church in Germantown, Maryland. She recently served as Director of Spiritual and Cultural Outreach for the 2020 presidential campaign of Andrew Yang, and she is currently, as I've already said, a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from Washington, D.C. in 2022. Welcome, Wendy.
Oh, thank you, Marianne. It's so good to be here. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm excited.
Well, when I first talked to you about your candidacy, you said, I'm not running against Eleanor Holmes Norton. I am running for. Tell us what you're running for.
I am running for DC. I'm running, certainly, as you mentioned, about Eleanor Holmes Norton. She has a storied legacy. I'm running to build on that. I'm running to be an authentic voice for our citizens who feel like DC is ready for its next chapter. And that's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm feeling and sensing. And so I would like to be that representative, because I also believe that DC residents deserve options, and democracy calls for that. So I also want to present myself as a viable option for those who are looking for options to be on the ballot in June.
I think it's a big issue. I'm getting up there in age, but I think after the age of 80, I don't know. I just think it's not like other areas where, one person has the job, another person has the job. There's still plenty of room for many more to have the job. When it comes to politics, there's only like one slot or two slots. And I think it's a very important issue that we let new people in to fulfill some of these roles and speak to the generation that they're in. I know you're a minister. One of the things that it's often said in the Jewish religion is that every generation has its own wisdom, every generation, because it has its own experience. So when you said before that you feel that it's time for DC to have its next chapter, and you could stand for that next chapter as a representative in well, you wouldn't be leaving town, but over at the Capitol building. Tell us about that new chapter for Washington, D.C. that you want to stand for in Congress.
Well, I think mostly it would be one that builds upon sort of this idea of DC statehood, right? Because that is a priority, and that is something that I would definitely continue to fight for, because I do believe 700,000 residents without representation is a human rights violation. That's just my personal feeling on that. So I would certainly continue that fight. But in the midst of that, I've never felt like we were a one-dimensional city. I felt like that we could work on other tangible solutions for DC residents while we're waiting for statehood to manifest. And so for me, for instance, universal basic income is a big part of my policy platform. And as you mentioned, I did work on the presidential campaign of Andrew Yang, who you and I both know, a very sweet and dear man who had a vision back in 2018 to run for the presidency. And it was based and rooted in a foundation of universal basic income, and that being given a lifeline to families who were feeling forgotten, who were feeling unheard, who were saying, hey, I can't get from point A to point B. As I started talking to people on the street here in DC, and yes, I do live right here in the district. I live in Ward 8. And for those who aren't familiar necessarily with Ward 8, with DC, we're made up of 8 wards, 2 of which are east of the river, east of the Anacostia River. And the demographic makeup is more Black and African American, and we have just more disparities that you find east of the river. So I'm proud to be running to represent those voices. And as I'm talking to some of those voters, they're saying to me, yes, you know what, Reverend Wendy, definitely want to do the statehood thing. I'm for that, but how's statehood going to help me put groceries on my table? How's statehood going to help me put gas in my car? We are feeling like we're drowning here, and that our leadership and our politicians are not in touch any longer with what's happening and have their finger on the pulse of what we need right now. Those are the people I want to speak on behalf of, because I get it. And so when I start talking about universal basic income, a recurring monthly payment that can go into your hands tangibly because we can afford it as a nation, when I start talking about those kinds of solutions, universal health care for all, when I start talking about education and bringing back vocational training, because we're losing a lot of our kids, to the streets here in DC and to violence, and I think it's rooted in poverty and despair. These were the things that I started to see a spark of life again in some of the voters, because they just seem to have given up.
I think that when a constituent sees somebody who's been in office for decades and nothing has really changed in their life experience, then it is reasonable that they are open to somebody new who would have some things to say that might contribute to the conversation. In this case, of course, it's not saying that the old is bad. It's just saying that the new is necessary, that we have to have that. And of course, that's why some people in this country are arguing for term limits. What is your experience as a minister? What do you think you bring to the table that is specific to the fact that you do have a divinity degree from Howard University? What is the intersection of your spiritual and religious beliefs and your political activism?
I believe it's an appreciation for where humanity is and having people come as they are and receiving them where they are, meeting them there and validating where they are. These are all skill sets that you develop as a minister. That and one of the biggest keys, I believe, to building trust and relationship, and that is being able to listen. Some people just want to be heard. And for so many, they feel like their voices are going unheard. And so I feel like I bring that essence as a minister to be able, I'm a really good listener, Marianne, and I want to hear what people are going through. I want to get a sense of what will genuinely help them begin to feel empowered again. A lot of my run is just as much about inspiration as it is about motivation, but it's also about education. You mentioned the length of time that Delegate Norton has been in her seat, 32 years. And if there's one prevailing thing that I'm hearing across the board is, that's too long. Voters are saying to me all over, that's the one common thing they're saying, we have a lot of respect for Delegate Norton. She's fine, but you can't stay beyond the time of your effectiveness, if you will. And so at some point, if we consider ourselves progressive, we need to allow progress to take place. And when you are not allowing progress to take place, and that is the new chapter to begin, the next phase to run its course, it speaks to where your motivation may be in the first place for remaining, right?
It's interesting when you talk about deep listening. I heard Oprah once say that people just want to feel heard. People want to feel seen. And particularly in Washington, D.C., where people really there's no one who can vote for them in Congress, but that voice can still be heard and can have an influence. And I think someone who can respond to the despair that so many people feel by saying, I hear you, I will speak for you. And I think that that's what people want right now. In fact, I think if people don't start feeling it real soon, something's going to blow in this country. And that's why it's so important that we support these new voices such as your own.
I see you, I hear you, and I am you, or I'm one crisis away from being right next to you. And because I recognize that, I'm going to fight for you, because fighting for you is fighting for me and fighting for others. And I don't want anyone to feel like I am elevating myself above their situation, because I am them.
Yeah, that's a really important issue, that someone feels not only seen, not only heard, but that someone understands, because they are right there. Like you said, you live in the ward that most needs representation. Where do you see America right now, Wendy?
Teetering on the brink. Literally teetering on the brink. It's almost as if everything that we came to experience or learn or be socialized to believe was normal or right or forward thinking, all has been blown to smithereens, Marianne. And I know you know this more so than most, because I know you sense it on multiple levels. We're hanging on by a thread, literally. And so I feel like in that moment, the world is calling out for light, for guidance, for what sliver of hope, some message that suggests that this thing can be different. We're never going to go back to where we were. And that's an okay thing too, I think, because it's been important
in many ways.
Yes, of learning a lot of lessons. But part of the motivation for my run too is I believe that the world is crying out for a moral renaissance, on Capitol Hill and across this nation. And when I speak to morality, I'm not speaking to a particular ideology. And I think that when you think about, moral causes and, religion and how that's been co-opted in many ways by certain messages and ideologies and approaches. And I like to consider myself part of the religious left, if you will, cut in the same cloth as a Reverend Barber, Senator Warnock, Reverend Warnock, that those voices. Even I remember Pete Buttigieg was talking about, his faith and expressing that folks, that
Be careful here.
I know. Maybe a little. I'm
a little farther from me. Yeah, I know. All jokes aside, Pete. All jokes aside.
But he was vocal about.
Yeah, let's go to FDR instead. You could have mentioned Marianne Williamson at that point, by the way, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll talk later. No. FDR said that the most important aspect of the presidency, he said, was not the administrative aspect, but the moral leadership. And I think that's true in politics. The idea of a moral leadership that, of course, is not doctrinaire or denominational, but is genuinely standing for universal moral values. And I think also when you talk about the kinds of changes that have to take place, when I came to Washington, one of the reasons I wanted to live here was because I wanted to feel the energy of this place. And people talk about Washington, D.C. being a bubble, but on the level of kind of how you feel when you're here, it's more than a bubble. It's like a walled city. You feel that people who have been there too long, who have been in office too long, are living within a reality. I mean, I don't think Trump would have become president if people in this town had realized what was coming. Some people could have told him what was coming. Too much despair, too much despair was building up. And if it wasn't going to, if the Democratic Party wasn't going to allow a progressive populace to express a response to that rage, then an authoritarian populace was on the way. But living here in Washington, I can see it. That's why I think these incumbents who have been there too long, you get sucked into this institutional attitude where they're in these beautiful buildings and in these beautiful office buildings and these beautiful meetings. And I don't think these people realize in some cases how close the masses are to the gates of the Bastille if something doesn't start changing. And that's why I think you and others like you who are taking a stand, saying about some of these incumbents, it is time to move over. It is time to let new voices in, people who have been close to the ground, not in those buildings, but close to the ground, hearing what's going on is so important.
If your motivation is still to represent the constituents and the voices of your people, listen to what they're saying. This is no longer about what you want or what, remember the folks who brought you in and go back and see what they're saying now. you said something about it being walled off. I like to say there's a Washington in our context. There's a Washington, which is over on the hill and behind, and then there's a DC. And I'm running to represent DC. Those 700,000 folks in the 8 wards that I'm talking about that are beautifully and culturally diverse, that their lives, our lives, are impacted by what happens in Washington. But I don't want people to confuse DC with Washington. And so if you're going to represent us, don't identify more with Washington than you do with DC.
You know, that's another thing. When I moved here, I had been to Washington, D.C. many times, and I had been to monuments, I'd been to hotels, I had been to office buildings, congressional office buildings. And I had been to those 3 places many, many times. I didn't realize there's quite a city here. It's an extraordinary city, and it's an extraordinary culture. It's rich and it's deep and it's funky and it's meaningful. And that's what needs to be represented. Well, I was so glad when I did hear you speak to hear, yes, this is someone really worth getting behind. What can people do to find out more about you, to contribute to your campaign? What would you like people to know, not only people in Washington, D.C., but around the country, so that they could support you?
Well, please know exactly what I've said here, that I am running with the heartbeat of this city in my own heart, and that I will serve from a place of leadership that remembers who sent me, remembers that I am not only representing them, I am them. And so to find out more about my platform, you can go right to revwendyforcongress.com. That's my website, and you'll see the events we've been involved in. You will see my policies listed out, and you can take a look at my issues page. Of course, there's a donation page there. So people that are not, here locally, if you would like to donate, you can certainly do that through Act Blue. Marianne also actually are a pro crypto campaign. So for those who are dibble-dabbling in cryptocurrency, that's because I look at it through an economic justice lens, and that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But you can also donate in cryptocurrency to our campaign. But really, the biggest thing that anyone can do for me is to help spread the word about my campaign. Because the reality is I am running against a 32-year incumbent with citywide name recognition. Now, granted, we recognize that, and we've been running for the last year because we understood that one of the obstacles we were up against was just getting our name out there. And I feel like we've laid a wonderful groundwork over the last year in doing that. The primary is June 21st. So we still have roughly 5 months to get our message across and to get voters on board. We just now started our ballot signature collection period. The window opened up. So every weekend we're going to be in different parts, different wards, collecting signatures. I have to get 2,000 signatures to get my name on the ballot. So those are different ways you can help.
Well, I think anybody who hears you, I felt this way when I first heard you, and I think anybody listening feels that way now. You have a voice that should be in the U.S. Congress, and that does speak for the working people of the United States. RevWendy.com, correct?
Rev Wendy for Congress.
Oh, I'm sorry. And is that numeral 4 or FOR?
That is FOR, Rev Wendy for FOR Congress.com. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, everybody, you heard it, RevWendyForCongress.com. Please give it a look. And if your heart responds to this woman as mine does, please do what you can. If you're here in DC, really help spread the word. And no matter what you are, you can support this congressional run. It's time for new conversations in Washington. It's time for a whole new energy up in that capital of ours. And Wendy Hamilton, Reverend Wendy Hamilton, is just the kind of person to bring it to us. Thank you, Wendy. Much love to you. Is there anything else you want to say to people? Do you think we covered it?
That's it, other than just having the blessing of Marianne Williamson. I feel like I've already won because you're
well, right back at you. We're all in this together. I think there's so many millions of people in the United States today who do feel that we're all sort of huddling together, hopefully giving birth to something new, a new birth of freedom, as Abraham Lincoln would say. Much love to you, honey. God bless.
See you later, sister. God bless you.